You know what's humbling? Realizing that craftsmen who lived 2,000 years ago figured out solutions to problems I've been struggling with my entire woodworking life. A few years back, I started digging into Roman woodworking after seeing photographs of furniture pulled from Herculaneum, the city buried alongside Pompeii. These pieces had been sealed under volcanic ash for nearly 2 millennia, and when I looked at the joinery, at the veneers, at how they'd bent wood into shapes I'd need a steam box and a whole afternoon to attempt, I realized we'd lost something, not just techniques, an entire way of thinking about wood. Today, I'm going to walk you through 5 Roman methods that either vanished completely or took over 1,000 years to rediscover. And stick around to the end because I'll share a layout trick from Roman shipwrights that changed how I mark out joinery. Let's get into it. The Romans weren't just empire builders. They were the most ambitious construction engineers the ancient world ever produced. And behind every stone aqueduct and marble temple, there was woodworking, scaffolding, formwork, roofing, furniture, ships. Understanding how they worked wood helps you see your own craft differently. So, let me share what I've learned. Here's what surprised me most when I started researching this. The Romans didn't treat woodworking as a lesser craft. They wrote about it seriously. Pliny the Elder devoted entire sections of his natural history to wood species, their properties, and how to work them. Vitruvius, the architect whose writings shaped building practice for centuries, gave detailed instructions on selecting and preparing timber. These weren't casual mentions. They were systematic, practical guides based on generations of accumulated knowledge. What made Roman woodworking different was scale. They needed timber for a fleet that dominated the Mediterranean. They needed scaffolding for buildings that still stand today. They needed furniture for an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt. That kind of demand forced them to develop methods that were efficient, repeatable, and designed to last. The Romans had access to forests we can barely imagine today. Old-growth European oak, cypress from Crete, cedar from Lebanon, citrus wood from North Africa that was so prized a single table could cost more than a country estate. They learned which species worked best for which purposes, not through guesswork, but through centuries of trial and observation across an enormous geographic range. And here's the part that matters for us. When Rome fell, much of that knowledge scattered. Some techniques survived in Byzantine workshops or medieval monasteries. Others vanished entirely until archaeologists started pulling Roman artifacts from the ground and asking, how on earth did they do this? What I want to share with you today are 5 methods that either disappeared or took far too long to find their way back. The first method involves how the Romans preserved their wood, and it's something most of us completely overlook. We tend to think of wood preservation as a modern concern, something involving pressure-treated lumber and chemical solutions. But the Romans understood that how you handle wood before you ever cut a joint determines how long that joint will last. Pliny describes a process where freshly felled timber was immediately submerged in running water and left there for an extended period, sometimes several weeks. The running water leached out the sap and sugars that attract insects and promote decay. After this soaking, the wood was stacked for air drying in covered areas with careful attention to airflow. The entire seasoning process could take years for large timbers. What struck me about this is how patient they were willing to be. We live in a world of kiln-dried lumber that goes from tree to home center in a matter of months. The Romans understood that rushing this process meant building in future failure. Archaeological studies of Roman ship timbers show remarkably low rates of insect damage and fungal decay compared to what you'd expect from untreated wood of that age. I started experimenting with extended air drying after reading about this, and the difference is noticeable. Wood that I let season for 18 months instead of 6 is more stable, easier to work, and finishes more evenly. It requires planning ahead, which is a discipline I'm still developing, but the results speak for themselves. The Romans weren't doing anything magical here. They just understood that time is an ingredient in good woodworking, and they refused to skip it. Now, the second method is one that genuinely shocked me when I learned the details. The Romans were cutting veneers thinner than most of us manage today, and they were doing it without power tools, without bandsaw resaws, without any of the equipment we consider essential for veneer work. Roman craftsmen used a tool called a frame saw with a blade held under tension in a wooden frame. This design allowed them to make remarkably thin, consistent cuts. Archaeological evidence and contemporary descriptions suggest they were producing veneers as thin as 1/16 of an inch, sometimes thinner. For comparison, commercial veneer today typically runs between 1/28 and 1/42 of an inch, but that's sliced on industrial equipment. The fact that Roman craftsmen achieved anything close to this by hand is extraordinary. The key was their approach to blade geometry and cutting technique. The Roman saw blades were set with minimal kerf, meaning very little wood was lost to sawdust with each cut. They used a pulling stroke rather than pushing, which gave them more control over thin, flexible blades. And critically, they understood that the wood itself had to be prepared properly. They would soak certain species before cutting to make them more pliable and less likely to split ahead of the blade. I tried this technique with a traditional frame saw on a piece of quarter-sawn white oak, and while my results weren't Roman quality, I was able to produce veneers around 3/32 of an inch thick, much thinner than I'd ever managed on my bandsaw without tear out. It's slow work, but there's something satisfying about producing veneer with hand tools, and it makes you appreciate just how skilled these craftsmen were. By the way, if you're finding this interesting, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss future videos from Dale Oakfield's workshop. All right, let's keep going. The third method is the one that made me question everything I thought I knew about bending wood. We tend to assume that steam bending is the only traditional approach to creating curves. Heat the wood, make it pliable, clamp it to a form, let it set. It works, and it's been the standard method for centuries. But the Romans had another technique that produced tighter bends with less springback, and it didn't require any steam at all. Roman shipwrights and furniture makers used a process that combined controlled soaking with something called compression setting. The wood was first submerged in water, sometimes treated water that had been enhanced with mineral salts or other additives, for an extended period. This wasn't just to make the fibers pliable. It was to fundamentally change how the wood structure responded to compression. After soaking, the wood was placed in a device that compressed it along its length while simultaneously applying the bend. The compression preloaded the outer fibers so they wouldn't stretch and fail during bending. What you got was a tight radius bend in species that would normally crack or splinter, with minimal springback once the piece was dried and released from the form. We know this technique existed because of the curves found in Roman ship construction and furniture. Some of these bends are simply too tight and too clean to have been achieved through steam bending alone, especially in the dense hardwoods they were using. And when archaeologists examined the cellular structure of bent Roman timbers under magnification, they found compression patterns consistent with this technique. I haven't fully replicated this process in my own shop yet. The equipment requirements are more involved than a simple steam box. But I've experimented with extended soaking combined with compression clamping, and even my crude attempts have produced bends in red oak that I couldn't achieve with steam alone. There's real science here that we've mostly forgotten. The fourth method involves layout and measurement, which might sound less exciting than wood bending, but it's actually where Roman ingenuity shows up most clearly. The Romans developed layout tools that were, in some ways, more sophisticated than what most of us use today. Their measuring and marking instruments weren't just accurate. They were designed to transfer measurements and angles in ways that minimized cumulative error across large projects. One tool that particularly impressed me is the Roman divider, which survived in various forms but lost some of its refinement over the centuries. Roman dividers featured adjustment mechanisms that allowed craftsmen to lock in a precise setting and maintain it through hundreds of repeated operations. When you're laying out the ribs of a ship or the frame of a large piece of furniture, being able to step off identical measurements without the setting drifting is critical. Modern cheap dividers slip. Roman dividers, based on the examples we've recovered, were engineered not to. But the real genius was in how they used these tools systematically. Roman craftsmen worked from reference surfaces and established baselines in ways that feel surprisingly modern. They understood that measuring from point to point across a project accumulates error, but measuring everything from a single established reference keeps the work true. This sounds obvious when I say it, but watch most woodworkers, myself included for too many years, and you'll see us measuring from wherever is convenient rather than from a disciplined baseline. The Roman approach to layout was also deeply connected to geometry. These craftsmen could divide a board into equal parts, establish precise angles, and create complex curves using nothing but dividers and a straight edge. No protractors, no calculators, no digital readouts. Just an understanding of geometric principles that most of us never learned. I've started incorporating more geometry-based layout into my own work, and it's both humbling and liberating. Humbling because I realize how much I relied on measurement crutches. Liberating because once you understand the principles, you can solve layout problems with remarkable elegance. The fifth method is Roman finishing, and this is where I think we've lost the most ground. Modern finishing is dominated by film forming, products, polyurethanes, and lacquers and varnishes that sit on top of the wood. The Romans took a completely different approach, one that worked with the wood's natural properties rather than sealing them away. Roman furniture was typically finished with oils and waxes that penetrated into the wood fibers. But what made their finishes exceptional wasn't the materials themselves. It was the preparation and application process. Before any finish was applied, the wood surface was burnished. This involved rubbing the surface with smooth stones, bone tools, or hardwood implements until the grain was compressed and polished. Burnishing closed the pores partially, created a natural sheen, and prepared the surface to accept oil in a controlled way. After burnishing, oils were applied in thin coats and worked into the wood with friction. The heat generated by rubbing helped the oil penetrate deeper and bond with the wood fibers. Multiple applications built up a finish that was part of the wood, not just sitting on top of it. The final step was typically a hard wax, often beeswax combined with other ingredients, buffed to a soft luster. I refinished a small side table using this method last year, and the difference in feel is remarkable. The surface has a warmth and depth that film finishes never achieve. You can feel the wood grain under your hand. And here's the practical benefit. When this finish wears or gets scratched, you repair it by adding more oil and wax. No stripping, no sanding back to bare wood, no starting over. The Romans built furniture to be maintained across generations, and their finishing approach reflects that long-term thinking. Let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years. Things I used to do myself that Roman craftsmen would have found puzzling. No judgment here. I did all of these for longer than I'd like to admit. The first pattern is rushing the wood. Most of us buy lumber and start cutting within days, sometimes hours. The Romans would have considered this reckless. They understood that wood needs time to stabilize, to release internal stresses, to reach equilibrium with its environment. I used to blame my joinery failures on technique when the real problem was impatient material preparation. The second pattern is over-reliance on power tools for tasks that hand tools do better. I'm not saying we should abandon our table saws and routers, but when I watch videos of my own work, I see myself reaching for power tools out of habit rather than consideration. The Romans matched the tool to the task with more deliberation. Sometimes the right tool is slower, but produces a superior result. The third pattern is finishing as an afterthought. We build the project, then figure out how to finish it. Roman craftsmen thought about finish from the moment they selected the wood. The species, the grain orientation, the surface preparation, Everything was considered as part of an integrated process. I've started planning my finish before I make the first cut, and it's changed how I approach every stage of the build. The fourth pattern is measuring instead of referencing. We reach for the tape measure constantly, generating numbers that we then have to transfer and remember. Roman layout practice emphasized direct transfer whenever possible. Instead of measuring a mortise and then measuring where to cut the tenon, you reference one directly from the other. Fewer numbers means fewer errors. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning, this comes from studying Roman shipbuilding, and it's a layout technique I've never seen in any modern woodworking book. When Roman shipwrights needed to mark joinery on curved or irregular surfaces, they used a method I call shadow marking. Instead of trying to measure angles and transfer them with a bevel gauge, they would hold the piece to be fitted in position against a strong light source. The shadow cast by the existing structure onto the new piece showed exactly where material needed to be removed. They would scribe directly along the shadow line. I started using this technique when fitting shelves into an old house with walls that were nowhere close to square. Instead of measuring the angle of the wall and trying to transfer it, I held the shelf blank in position with a work light behind the wall. The shadow showed me exactly where the shelf met the irregular surface. I scribed the line and cut to it. Perfect fit on the first attempt. It sounds almost too simple, but that's what I love about it. The Romans solved complex fitting problems with observation and cleverness rather than complicated measurement. Once you start thinking this way, you find applications everywhere. Fitting drawer fronts, scribing cabinet backs to uneven walls, marking chair legs for uneven floors. Shadow marking works for all of it. If any of this changed how you think about woodworking, or made you curious about what else the ancients figured out that we've forgotten, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Tell me what techniques you've discovered from historical sources, or what methods you'd like me to explore in future videos. And if you want more of these deep dives into traditional woodworking wisdom from craftsmen who were solving problems long before power tools existed, hit subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thanks for spending time with me today in the shop. I'll see you in the next one.